now they've run out of tax space, and they know they've run out of tax space, they can't raise taxes anymore, they're going to have to start going for supply side reform. But at the moment, the Treasury sat there with their hands on their head going, God, we can't raise more taxes. I think next month when we see the spring statement, was it later this month, one of the two, we are going to be in a really serious situation, and I think the opposition bench is going to have a really good time, and Labour are going to have a really hard time, because we just have no more money left, Nikolai. It's all gone.
If the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money, then the problem with social democracy is that you eventually run out of people who are willing to give you more of their money. My guest today claims that the UK is near a threshold. Our government plans to radically increase spending, but won't be able to raise taxes to pay for it. A world where higher taxes do not result in more tax revenue would be a radical change from where we are today. For example, it would completely upend the topics that have dominated political discourse in the UK since Liz Truss was elected. Sort of. The last time my guest came on, his claims proved to be so unpopular, it set a record for unsubscribes from our YouTube channel. So I thought we better have him back for a second helping. Maxwell Marlow of the Adam Smith Institute joins me to discuss some rather embarrassing problems for our Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. Maxwell, thanks for coming back on so soon.
It's good to be back, and sorry about the unsubscribers. Hopefully we can make them up this time round.
Well, telling people they'll have to sell their houses is only ever going to go down one way, but I think we got some nice comments as well. So check out actually our previous video on pensions if you're interested to see what the controversy is all about. But for this video, Maxwell, I want to start with a chart from the Office for Budget Responsibility. It's a projection of future government spending and tax revenue. Now, these two lines seem to diverge just a little bit over time. Are you getting worried about this exponential projection of our future?
I am quite concerned about it, because I think we're already over the other side of the Laffer Curve, which I think is something we'll come on to discuss in a bit. The issue we're facing is that essentially we have this welfare state, which is there, that we've been voting for so long, to build up and up and up and up ever since the Attlee governments of 1945 and onwards, and we've never really stopped and gone, seems it's getting rather expensive. So the two big issues we're facing here fundamentally is demographics. So older people who tend to be sicker, and they also tend to rely more on stuff like the NHS, also stuff like social care. That's going to get more and more expensive as time goes on. And how do you pay for that? Well, you have to get productivity increases. But the problem is we haven't had a real productivity increase since about 2007, so pre-Great Financial Crash. So with demographics getting older, and with the cost of that going up and up and up, there's only one way you can really pay for it. I mean, we could print more money. That went down really badly over COVID, but there's only really one way you can pay for that, and that is through, you guessed it, raising taxes. So the question then comes, will we be able to extract more money from the economy? Maybe. We have to remember that actually in the UK, we actually pay quite low levels of tax compared to, per person compared to our European neighbours. But I don't think the British people want to pay more tax. There's some very interesting polling out from people like Dan Needle, who runs Tax Policy Associates. And he asked people, he said, would you be happy paying more tax to fund public services? And everyone came back and said, oh, yes, absolutely. That would be absolutely fine. And then he asked the killer question, how much more are you willing to pay? And even answers up to £20 extra a month, people said, no, too much. So that's one of the big issues we're facing here. So how do you fund all of these great, well, not so great public services that need massive reform? How are we going to do that? And at the moment, Rachel Reeves has, two options: grow the economy. That's not happening. We're in a per capita recession at the moment. Or raise taxes, which will affect the growth side. So those are the big issues.
Yeah, and in our last video, we looked at some of the issues on the spending side. This one, it's going to get a bit more confusing and intriguing, because we're going to be talking about whether or not the government has the ability to raise more taxes, even if they wanted to, even if they pass legislation, even if they raise tax revenue. Because you and I both believe that we're at some sort of a threshold where higher tax rates won't result in more tax revenue. This is based on the idea of the Laffer Curve, as you mentioned. Maxwell, what is the Laffer Curve?
So back in the 80s, there was a guy called Art Laffer. He's still around with us, and he was advising President Reagan on what does the tax system really look like. So he took out a paper napkin and he just drew a curve. So what we call a Gaussian curve. So just a bell curve goes up and down, and he said this is how taxes work. So if you start at zero, 0% tax, you don't raise any money, obviously. If you go all the way up to 100% tax, you don't raise any money either because people just stop, uh, you know, performing economic activity at 100%. And in between, it basically does that. So there is an optimal point of taxation where you can get the most economic productivity per unit whilst also getting the optimal amount of tax. Now, Art was very clever insofar as he didn't say to President Reagan, this is where the optimal point is. This is classic market economics here. You have to experiment, and see where that optimal point is. My concern, Nikolai, is very simple. We are past that point at the top. I think we are now sliding down the Laffer curve, and there's lots of evidence to show that actually we are at that point now, and we need to start either cutting taxes, raising thresholds, or growing the economy in order to allow people to pay more tax. Now, I say allow, most people don't want to pay more tax. I should be very clear with that. As I said earlier, people don't really want to pay more tax. It'd be much easier if we had lower rates. But as you said earlier, the OBR have said we need to start paying more tax in order to pay for those public services we all vote for and we all want. So that's the big challenge. The Laffer curve really is that really critical point that I know Rachel Reeves is looking at the moment.
What intrigues me about this, and always has actually, is that everyone sort of agrees about the 100% tax rates means no tax revenue because no one's going to work. Everyone agrees 0% tax rates means no tax revenue because it's 0%. But in between, there's sort of a state of denial where people claim the Laffer curve doesn't exist, right? Where sort of mathematically it must. So how controversial is this idea? How widely believed is it by politicians, economists, modelers, voters, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so we can take those in turns. So let's look at economists first. So most economists agree that there is Laffer curve. Right? That is pretty uncontroversial. We know how the numbers work there. The big contention is, what does that Laffer curve look like? So Art, when he first came up with the concept, just did this. Now, some people say that it kind of goes up a long way and then drops off very suddenly at the end. That's technically a Laffer curve. And, likewise, people think it's a very small hump. They don't really think. So it depends on which side, if you're an economist, which side you really sit on.
Let's quickly specify what that changing shape means. So if you've got a Laffer curve that a low rates taxation sort of rises and then a very high rates taxation, suddenly it drops off. That would imply that we can increase taxes a fair bit more before people will stop working as much as they might have at lower rates of taxation, right?
Yeah, and I think the OBR think that, by the way. I think that's what the OBR think. So their economists think that. We at the Adam Smith Institute and our friends at the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Taxpayers Alliance, we don't think that at all. We think it is a classic Art Laffer curve. And yes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just think that's really where we are there.
No, spot on. That's exactly what I was trying to get at. So you continue then. What about the politicians? Are they believe, especially the Labour politicians, are they big believers in the Laffer curve?
Well, it depends if the politicians know their economics. So some politicians have no concept of this whatsoever, and they don't even. Some politicians I've spoken to on both in both main parties in the UK, they aren't even aware of the concept of the Laffer curve. Right? They just think if they're going to put tax up, let's say a penny on income tax, they just think that's going to come straight in. They're not aware of efficient markets hypothesis. They're not aware of destroying consumer surplus. They're not aware of disincentives within the economy. They just think if you raise the tax, like Newton's apple falling upon his head, more revenue must suddenly fall into the treasury and they can spend it like golly, right? So many politicians don't understand that. The politicians who do understand the Laffer curve and are aware of it, they're much more concerned. Now, I should say there are politicians in the Labour Party who are very concerned about the Laffer curve because actually they agree with us that actually we're past the point. We need to start thinking about other options. And of course, classic Thatcherites in the Conservative Party, who read their Friedman and their Hayek and their Adam Smith. I should hope everyone listening reads their Adam Smith. It's very good for you. they're all quite concerned. Hey, if you tax too much, it's going to get really, really bad. So yes, it's some politicians don't understand. Let's talk about voters, Nikolai. No, I think because the voters, the ones paying the tax, they know the Laffer curve the most. And when we look, we just with the ASI, the Institute have just released a business confidence survey. Some of the responses we got from business leaders we surveyed, people who run their own businesses, they can be quite small. They said we've actually stopped working at certain points throughout the year or throughout the month, right, in order not to cross the threshold into higher tax brackets, right? There is real evidence of this happening. We can actually see it in the NHS as well. It's been very interesting, right? So there was a big debate last year about essentially doctors' pensions, and there was this all hubbubaloo about what's the threshold that we pay even more into our pension that becomes untaxed. It got to the point where quite senior doctors who were paying a lot into their pension schemes would stop working an hour before their their bill would fall over the top of that, and then patients would be left not being able to get treatment. Other doctors have to go in and pick up what's left. But the doctors were very, very clear on this. They said, we're not working a second more in case we fall into a higher tax bracket, then it's not worth us working, right? Two really good examples of where the Laffer curve really hits home, that essentially you slip on the other side and you lose your revenue, right? So I've got loads of them and we can explore it throughout the rest of this video.
I feel like when people are thinking about the Laffer curve, that it only applies to someone else. There's high earners, the top tax bracket, and they don't think about the fact that those high earners sort of have a choice whether or not to work those extra hours or not. And the more you tax them, the less likely they are to do it. But before we get to some more evidence, and there's some sort of high level statistical analysis type of evidence, as well as these micro side that you've given me with specific examples of specific people pretty much. Let's talk about why. Why does the Laffer curve hold true? Specifically, the far end of the Laffer curve that we think we're on, where higher tax rates might not lead to higher tax revenues. Why doesn't that happen?
So there are a few different reasons, really, and I'll touch on a couple. So the first I'll touch on is labour market. So what we call the backwards bending labour supply curve, right? And that means people who engage their labour split their time between taking leisure time out and additional time working, right? And that curve goes a bit like this. So people are very strange about how they choose to allocate their labour time. And we looked at private schools, for example, the raise on private school fees. And what we found was that if you push the private school fees too high, people actually start, they'll take their kids out of school and they're left with £15,000 extra from their work. Now, economists at the Institute for Fiscal Studies had argued previously in this study they were doing that actually that's okay because they'll just return all of that money back into the economy. They don't, now it's excess. They'll just spend it on vatable goods, or they'll buy more booze, and that goes on duties, whatever else. We looked at some different studies, the IFS. In fact, we introduced, we were the first think tank to bring this into this conversation, this back spending spike. We found that actually people just withdraw that labour, right? Because they've got to pay tax on that extra £15,000, and they'll put it into leisure time instead. So they'll go cycling, or they'll, do the garden, whatever else. That's one of the big concerns that no one was really thinking about, right? So there's what people choose to do with their time. That's the first area.
Let's try and clarify that, just in case anyone's confused, because that's a really fascinating example of this. So I think what you're saying is that because of the tax increase, the VAT increase on private school fees, some people are taking their children out of private schools, so they don't want to pay this huge increase in fees. And economists assume that people would continue to earn as much money as they were before. But this saving that they've generated on not having to pay private school fees any longer, instead of continuing to work so they could earn that money, they're now working less. So the overall tax take potentially could fall, because instead of earning the money and having to pay tax on it and then pay the private school fees, people are now working less.
Exactly. So
and
let's say you're...
sorry to continue, Maxwell, because this is so fascinating. Yeah. The marginal tax rate on a private school paying taxpayer is probably higher than the VAT rate.
It's 40% up. right?
Yeah.
So private school fees in the UK are very expensive. A lot of that actually comes down to labour supply, because people, expect from their schools, they expect smaller class sizes, need more teachers per student. So the labour calculations here are very important. What also, just on a side note, I'm sorry, this is one of my big touch topics here, but the raise in national insurance contributions from employers pushed up those prices even higher than we were expecting, right? So now there's an average increase of 14% on fees year on year from last year to this year, way out of scope from previous decades, right? So that means that big push actually pushed people out of work if they withdrew their kids from school. So we were looking at parents who were working 3 jobs, right? And if you suddenly don't have to pay the extra 14, 15, 16,000 pounds per year, why would you get yourself out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning to drive an hour down the road to do this job you don't want to do, but you're only doing it to put your kids through school? So people are just withdrawing their labour because they feel they're on the other side of the Laffer curve. I brought up the doctors earlier. It's the same point. They feel like their time's better spent on a golf course than they do under very high pressure surgeries, doing brain surgery or heart surgery, or whatever else. It's classic. It's just classic human behaviour. We don't put people to work for 100% of their time, right? We give them time off, we give them lunch breaks and breaks throughout the day. You start at 9, you end at 5, depending on what your contract is, right? Because we know that people become much less efficient if you work them too hard. It's exactly the same with the tax system. If you work the tax system too hard, people remove it, right? I've got one more example of this, by the way, when it comes to energy investment, right? So the headline rate for oil and gas companies in the UK, I believe it's about 80%, right, for the tax rate, because we have an energy profits levy that goes on top of an extraordinary corporation tax levy on top of corporation tax. They're paying ginormous sums of tax. If you're a shareholder in an energy company, why would you choose to invest more? The money just goes to the government. So that's why BP have gone, we're out, we're off, right? Lots of energy companies are just not investing in the UK because it doesn't make economic sense. If you brought that rate down, I've spoken to some people, energy companies, right? They said, look, if you actually cut the rate down, we'll invest more and we'll bring energy prices down. Government don't want to do it because it's a really nice cash cow for the government for what's left in the UK. So this is why we don't tax 100%. Right, or 80. Well, we should tax at 80, definitely not at 70, etc. We think the optimal tax rate, and the taxpayers like to do good work on this, is actually around about 30%, right? About a third of your time. That's understandable. So when you're a high rate taxpayer and you're paying 40, an additional rate taxpayer, you're paying 45%. Your personal allowance is gone. You're valuing your time very, very much for the labour you're putting in. So that's really the striking point on the Laffer curve there.
Yeah, we're all happy to debate what that percentage might be that's the optimum, and whether we even want to be at the optimum. That's another story. But the last one I want to mention as an example for why the Laffer curve doesn't work is that people can leave the country, right? And so historically that was a big issue, and it may be currently again, which we might get to shortly. So take us through some of the macro modelling of how this is perceived as well. What's the evidence? Because, you and I are sort of fairly convinced that Rachel Reeves has got this Wile E. Coyote moment where she's sort of charged off the end of the Laffer curve and hiked tax rates, thinking it's going to raise more revenue. But actually, she's on the far side of the Laffer curve where tax rate increases, reduce the amount of tax revenue raised. So now she's sort of looking down and she's going, oh no, we're over the far side of the Laffer curve. What is the evidence from the statistical macro side for this?
So what we can see essentially is it's actually not just Rachel Reeves. It was Jeremy Hunt before her. Since COVID, we've kind of been totally overexerted. So in terms of where we're looking with some of these revenues, so let's take capital gains tax, for example. Just before capital gains tax was brought up, we saw the Treasury come back and say this is fair. Those with the broader shoulders need to bear the largest burden. We saw CGT receipts skyrocket. We saw them go absolutely massive. People sold a lot of their equity and their stock, and they actually put it elsewhere, into trusts and in different accounts that the HMRC can't touch, right? So that was on capital gains tax. We've seen the rate go up slightly. That's kind of a general inflator that happens within the economy. Asset prices are still rising, so unsurprising there. But some of the modelling that we've done at the ASI, we've seen that actually CGT rates really should be cut because that will increase your receipts. It encourages people to invest back in the UK. We did some modelling a few years ago now, looking at historic CGT rates, capital gains tax rates, and we found that whenever you cut capital gains tax rates, actually the receipts increased over an inflated amount. So in real terms, they increased. So the evidence is there on that kind of level. A little bit more difficult to say on the macro level. What we do see, though, is that everyone from the Institute of Fiscal Studies through to us at the Adam Smith Institute, to people like Dan Needle at Tax Policy Associates, are basically saying we need to actually shift a lot of the thresholds we're on. We need to index the thresholds, stop freezing them, because that will allow them to rise with inflation and therefore not trap people at those low areas. So the reason why the government wants to freeze tax rates, and it sounds really good to voters. If I'm a politician, I come to you as a voter and I go, hey, look, I froze your tax rates. You go, yay, that's fantastic. Isn't that wonderful? What that actually means is that for every penny, that you're earning naturally as your wages increase, your salary increases, whatever else, it means that essentially more and more of your money is going straight to the exchequer. Right. So what we've been calling
the key force there is the inflation, right? I never thought of this in this way, that the government, the politicians are selling you, we're going to freeze your tax rate. And that's like, it's worse than bait and switch, really, isn't it? Because it's a terrible thing. If your wages increase and wage rate tax brackets are frozen, then more of your income will be in the higher tax bracket. So you'll actually be worse off, because inflation, of course, is higher pay, but your purchasing power is falling.
It's what we call fiscal drag.
Yeah.
It's what we call fiscal drag, right? So fiscal drag is a huge issue for the British economy, which is that, as I said, we froze those rates, and we froze the rates kind of across the board. We've been calling to unfreeze and to get rid of fiscal drag for years. The problem is, though, it's now so expensive to get rid of the fiscal drag that it's actually a really hard economic choice for chancellors and politicians to make to voters. They say to you, we can either unfreeze the rates and we have less money for the NHS or for defence or for roads, etc., or we can give you more of your money back, right? And we can let your wages grow. But so that's a really hard choice for politicians to pitch.
It's even more nefarious than that, though, because by freezing the tax brackets, the government benefits from inflation, from causing inflation, right? Because inflation pushes more people into the higher tax bracket. So it creates an incentive for governments and to central banks who are trying to keep governments on a sort of fiscal level, stable playing field, increases this incentive for them to cause inflation in the first place.
Yeah. So I think we've dealt with fiscal drag there. I'll come on to tobacco, because I think tobacco is really interesting. Essentially, tobacco increases continuously. There's an inflator attached. Actually, it's like 2% additional on top of whatever the chancellor comes out and says the tobacco rate's going up by. There was a note, I believe, this is a rumor circulated, so I won't be, just put that out there very clearly. The IFS apparently wrote to the Treasury and said, by the way, if you want to get more tobacco duty out, you should actually cut the rate, because now 30% of all the cigarettes in the UK consumed are from the black market, which aren't taxed and they're unregulated. I think it's around 40% of all rolling tobacco as well. So we are now, with the age ban coming in, we're handing over the entire tobacco market to criminals, and anyone who's listening from Australia will understand what that looks like with the fire bombings that are going on in the shops. But we've got a huge smuggling operation in the UK. With in Belarus, there are factories literally started up to sell illegal cigarettes to the UK market. It is a flourishing trade, and what the IFS has allegedly said, behind closed doors to the Treasury, is cut the damn tobacco rate, and you'll get more of their income in. Can't do it off political reasons because we want to, ban smoking and whatever else. That looks really bad. But what we do know is that we're way past the Laffer Curve there, and it ends up being I can walk around Westminster, like literally next to the National Legislature and the government, and see packets of black market cigarettes just lying on the floor from people who just throw them on the floor. Right? That's how bad it's got, and that's because we're so far past the Laffer Curve on that one. Even though smoking rates are falling, so it's baffling. Some really baffling stuff going on from people who just refuse to understand what the Laffer Curve is.
And that being another example of why the Laffer Curve is true, because you drive people onto the black market, to the grey economy, and so on and so forth, if their tax rates are too high. And some of the Southern European economies are good examples of that. There was a good example under Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor of the revenue raised from the tax on spirits. I think it was Scotch whisky actually fell despite the tax rate increasing back in 2023 and 2024. I'll show a quote from the Telegraph on screen. There is actually also some official modelling from inside the Treasury, which suggests that increasing taxes on private equity, high net worth individuals, and non-dom residents would actually reduce the amount of revenue raised. What I don't understand about this, you're a perfect person to explain it to me, is if this is not controversial, why are they still making these mistakes?
Because it's politically convenient. That's the thing. So there's a very interesting book by a guy called Dr. Rainer Zeitelman, which is called The Rich and Public Opinion, which looks at how different societies view the wealthy. And in the UK, we hate the wealthy. We really, really hate the wealthy. That's why we want to keep taxing them more and more and more. So with the non-doms issue, for example, so this was actually started by Rishi Sunak because his wife is a non-domicile tax resident. And he thought it'd be more politically convenient to go, I'll tax my wife, right, than deal with the issue of actually, the whole system's a total mess, and we need to deal with that in a different way. So Henley and Partners, which is a law firm in the UK, they commissioned a guy called Andrew Amoles out of from a company called New World Wealth, a South African wealth management company. Very nice guy, he's really, really lovely. He's got a really interesting methodology to tracking wealthy people. He basically goes through tax records from different companies. He goes through LinkedIn, tracking high net worth individuals. And essentially, he found that in 2024, 9,500 high net worth individuals left the UK. He's since updated that to be 11,500. So I spoke to Andrew and I said, hey, look, what's the likelihood that these individuals are millionaire taxpayers? So they're paying £1 million income tax. Now, there aren't that many of them in the UK, I'll be honest, because we're actually a relatively poor country when it comes to Western nations. But most of them will be. So I can say, okay, fine, I can justify that. So I did some back of the fag packet calculations. I worked out that, because the 11,500 high net worth individuals who left last year, it cost the Treasury in terms of, average households taxpayers, it cost the equivalent of the city of Manchester in income tax, right? 500,000 taxpayers essentially just walked out the door last year. And that's even less revenue and less productivity for the exchequer. So the reason we keep doing this kind of insane anti-wealth policy stuff, because it polls really well, right? Let's look at corporation tax, right? Why did Rishi Sunak put up corporation tax when he was Chancellor? I can tell you exactly why, because I spoke to the special advisors who were sitting around the coffee room discussing it. Because it polled well, because it polled really well with the public, because they went to the public and they said, okay, we've got to pay for more NHS spending. So, do you want to see an increase in income tax, an increase in national insurance? Do you want to see an increase in VAT, capital gains, whatever? Like people are quite aware of that sort of stuff. Or do you want to tax business? Do you want to tax big business? Now, you can't just tax big business. That's really hard to do. So instead, they just put up corporation tax, 25%. And we've spoken to business people, as part of my role at the ASI to do that. And, we found that they've just gone, what on earth are you doing? You're making us so much less competitive. And now we're seeing companies literally leave the UK and set up elsewhere, employ workers in other countries, set up supply chains there, pay tax there, sell their products there, because it's too expensive to operate in the UK. Again, this business confidence survey we just did, over 7 in 10 businesses we polled said they've got no to low confidence in the UK business environment. That's really, really concerning. Part of that is because these really expensive taxes we put on businesses and wealthy people, they just poll well. Just politicians looking at polling and going, great, let's do that, and ignoring the modelling.
I enjoy the paradox in the idea that wealthy people don't pay taxes and big companies don't pay taxes, and yet they leave when the tax rates increase. You can't have it both ways. Right, so are we at the peak of the Laffer curve where neither tax increases nor tax cuts would increase revenue, or where on the Laffer curve are we in your estimation?
I think we're on the other side now. So we're seeing what happens when we go on the other side. Business leaves. We're now having to try and get more people back into work. We were very reliant for the past few years on a lot of immigration into the UK, a lot of low-skilled immigration, because it was actually more profitable for a lot of British people to claim welfare and not work. It made more sense to them because the maths worked in walking down to the to the job centre and saying, hey, I'd like to sign on for out of work benefit. or claiming disability benefit because it just made more sense, right? Just made more sense in order to have a living, to
Maths, basic
to
maths.
not work. Yeah, basic maths, right? So that's how far past the Laffer curve we are. We've been past the Laffer curve for a long time. We've been ringing the bell, ding 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 ding, saying, look, we are so far past this curve, we need to start slashing or growing at an unprecedented rate, essentially, right? So every year, the Adam Smith Institute, we do something called Tax Freedom Day. We look at what is the average day in the year that the average person in the UK finishes working for the Treasury and works for themselves. And we found that last year it was June 6th, right? So if you take your total salary, you're an average person, about 30 odd thousand pounds, you look at your tax bill, all the taxes you're paying, VAT, stamp duty for some, whatever, we annualize it, and you finish working halfway through the year for the Treasury, right? That's how mad this is. And it goes up and up the more you earn, right? So I'm sure if you're a high rate taxpayer, you start working for the Treasury in like August, right? So we haven't done the calculations yet this year. We'll see what they look like, but don't expect it to be any earlier than June 6th. It's going to be much later.
That implies that tax cuts would increase tax revenue, right?
Yeah, it does. We know that's the case. We speak to business people. Say if we cut your taxes on, capital investment, if we cut your taxes, your taxes on workers, your jobs tax stuff, they'd employ more people, they'd invest more in capital, right? It's really that simple, and they've been very clear about that. It's just the issue. The issue is we just can't really afford to do it, right? So you've got to take some really tough decisions in terms of cutting down on state spending. And one of the big issues we face actually in the UK, I'll refer to state sector pensions on this one. So state sector pensions are defined benefits. So essentially, you know what you're getting at the end of your stint. Speaking to people in the trust team when she was number 10, they said, look, this is a serious burden. We're talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of pounds down the line to pay for these state pensions. What if we just, said to, civil servants, hey, look, we'll front load some of the money. We'll give you a big pay rise. You just have to go to a defined contribution benefit system. And they went to the Treasury. The Treasury said, no, won't work because of our in-year spending rules. So the Treasury basically say you can only spend this much in a year. We're not going to shift on that. Sorry. So you need to be paying trillions of pounds in the future. You can't fix the problem at a point where it can be fixed. We'll have to deal with the problem when it comes up.
So let's explore the idea of the Laffer curve suddenly becoming a mainstream idea across the board. Everyone suddenly believes that tax increases do not increase tax revenue. What changes? What happens to British politics and government policy if that were to occur?
I think people are already cognizant of it. They just can't name the Laffer curve. So we've done some polling and we've worked out that actually people think there's way too much tax on everyday people, working people. So people are already they know their kind of threshold. They just haven't verbalized it yet. And that's why Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer coming in said, we've got to go for growth. That's the only way we can pay for things. I think people understand that. So I don't think it's a case of what happens when they realise. I think it's already been realised, to be honest.
But it's not like anyone's calling for tax cuts to increase tax revenue.
Yeah, but it's only because the issue is any tax cut's expensive at this point, right? We're running a huge deficit.
The whole point is
it wouldn't be in the medium run, right? These things take time to settle in. So as soon as you cut that tax, behaviours are going to have to start changing, but that takes maybe a couple of years to set in. But as soon as you cut the tax, the revenue starts falling.
Yeah.
Right?
So let's explore that in a bit more detail, because this to me is the crucial point, which most discussions about Laffer curve don't mention, which is that time plays a crucial role. The easiest way to explain this is to think about computer games where you're, the ruler of an empire or a civilization, and it's very simple. You set the tax rate, and it's a trade-off over time. So if you increase the tax rate on your little civilization on your computer, what happens is tax revenue goes up, but economic growth slows. So in the future, your tax rate or your tax revenue has decreased. So it's a trade-off between time. More taxes now means less in the future. And so the basis of this computer game simulation is you want to try and tax as low as possible, but still survive against your competitors in sort of these military battles, right? And the idea is that in the future, your economy will be so big and so powerful and so technologically advanced that your taxes will be able to fund a military to defeat them. That's the basic way computer games this sort work. And it's the same for the Laffer curve and for tax policy, where every time it politicians raise taxes, what they're really doing is saying, hey, we need the money now, even though it's coming at the expense of the future. So it's very similar to borrowing money. It's saying the economy is going to grow less in the future, but we need that money now. And so the Laffer Curve discussion should be framed that way by politicians, right? It should say, look, we can't increase taxes anymore because the economy is just not going to grow anymore. And like we had in that OBR chart at the beginning, the whole issue here is that the growth in expenses is going to outpace the growth in tax revenue. So the question is, how can we grow tax revenue over time, which is what you focus on so often with the supply side reforms and economic growth. Yep. But why is that time aspect so lost in the Laffer Curve discussion?
It's because essentially it's a case of office-seeking politicians. So politicians want to, the currency of politics is votes. And if you're at the stage where, I mean, look at the Labour majority at the moment, it's very large, but it's very thin, right? So a lot of senior party politicians are on quite thin margins. I look at Wed Streeting, for example, in Ilford North. He's on sub 100 margin, right? So it's likely he'll be out of the next election. And if he's got to go back to his constituents in 4 years when the behaviour's only really started to change, we've only just started to see an uptick in tax revenue from various areas we've cut at the expense of increased borrowing, at the expense of cut public services, he's out, right? So what's the incentive, personal incentive for him as a politician to back those cuts? It's not there. So it's kind of the issue you mentioned it in your introduction about social democracy, which is essentially we're dealing with a very jumpy electorate who want more public services but don't want to pay more tax, or suffer the consequences of paying more tax fundamentally. So that's kind of the issue. So it's going to take a very brave government. I'm actually, maybe your listeners will disagree with me on this. I don't want to cause you to lose more subscribers, Nikolai, but I think Labour will be able to get a hold on this over the next couple of years. They've been very slow and very cack-handed in how they've done the budget. But I think there is actually a silver lining, which is that now they run out of tax space, and they know they've run out of tax space. They can't raise taxes anymore. They're going to have to start going for supply side reform. And we are speaking to MPs who are actually pushing for supply side reform when it comes to housing and building and whatever else, and even some areas of energy. So that's the exciting part. Hopefully that comes to fruition. But at the moment, the Treasury sat there with their hands on their head going, God, we can't raise more taxes. I think next month when we see the spring statement, was it later this month, one of the two, we are going to be in a really serious situation. And I think the opposition bench is going to have a really good time, and Labour are going to have a really hard time because we just have no more money left, Nikolai. It's all gone.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning public sector pensions earlier, by the way, because one of the main comments that we had in the earlier video was questions about public sector pensions and the trillions there. Something else you said in that video was when you mentioned the Laffer Curve actually as well. You said, so government can either print the money, it can grow the economy to extract more taxation, or they can raise taxes. But as I said, we're overtaxed already. We're way past the tip of the Laffer Curve. So let's explore the other options. You said supply side reform. I think my audience and I are a little bit more skeptical about that, at least to any sort of meaningful extent. What about the other options of inflation? And then I suppose you could also say widen the tax base to tax things that aren't taxed yet. You mentioned taxing people's primary residence as one option. There are other ways this could go, not just supply side reforms. They could make it worse yet.
Yeah, they could make it worse. So the issue is we're taxing everything at the moment, basically everything. I'm surprised I haven't come for the air yet. So I think we could extend taxes to prime residents, fine, yeah, but it's not going to raise huge amounts of money. It's not going to raise the money we need. I'm a supply side economist. I think that cutting down on supply side is the best thing. We're one of the most regulated economies in the world. I always come back to the Town and Country Planning Act 1947. Basically impossible to build anything. If you can't build anything, then you can't make real investments. There's a reason why we've got a very serious housing crisis. I mean, even if you cut all the immigration that's come in over the last few years, we would sorry. Yes, we're very agitated. Even if we cut all the immigration we've had over the last years, we'd still have a housing crisis. Still be very severe, and it's because we're not building the right houses in the right places. So that's one issue. We can look at, for example, one area that I've been very active in calling for cutting taxes is stamp duty. Any of your listeners and viewers who have recently sold a house or bought a house, they'll be very aware of the cost of stamp duty and what that does to the housing chain and the kind of destructive level at which stamp duty causes. So that's one area we could be looking at. But again, we've got to pay for it. So the only thing you've got to do is essentially, okay, let's say we go for inflation. Let's say we print loads of money and push the inflation level higher. Then it will be basically incumbent upon the Bank of England to raise interest rates. So that makes it harder to borrow to invest. It makes it harder for cost of living because it's unlikely that wages would follow. We've seen essentially wages stagnated over the last few years. So that makes the cost of living experience much harder. That actually worsens people's health because they get more stressed, or they can't afford to turn their gas on or their heating. Therefore, they end up in hospital, and the hospitals can't cope. So inflation is just a tax, right? It's an invisible tax on the pennies and pounds that we spend. I don't think it is the answer at all. I think we shouldn't have an unaccountable central bank that just runs wild and prints money doolally whenever it wishes. But I do think that we need to be very careful about inflation, and politicians don't actually quite understand why inflation happens. And I think there is a concern that essentially if we just print more money and raise the inflation rate, we can get more revenue and pay everything down. You end up a kind of a Weimar Germany situation where you could pay down the Versailles obligations through printing of money. Look what happened there. Or you can look at Zimbabwe, you can look at Venezuela, these countries which are kind of hyperinflated to pay off debts and pay off obligations. Their people are not very happy, and I don't want us to be in that situation either.
Yeah, the curious Western Indies. Nevertheless, that is the scenario I'm expecting. Not so much Weimar and Zimbabwe, but I'm expecting the Bank of England to use inflation to try and devalue the debt. That's a topic for an upcoming video. There's a very easy way to think about this video, which is that you and I would be doing something more useful and paying more taxes if we didn't have to complain about the government's terrible policies. So there's an example of the Laffer Curve in action for you. Maxwell, thanks very much for taking the time again, especially so soon. This has been excellent. I've actually learned a whole lot from you, and I hope the readers have too.
Thank you, Nikolai.
Given the projections for government spending and tax revenue are diverging at an exponential pace, something has got to give. The government must either print the money, grow the economy, or cut spending. Those three paths are very divergent in terms of their outcomes for investors. If governments cut spending, then defense stocks will reverse their recent gains, green energy stocks will hit even lower lows, and infrastructure companies might join them. If governments choose to print the money that they need and use inflation to devalue our debts, then bond prices will crash again, as they did in 2022 and 2024. Our pension system, which invests heavily in bonds, could go belly up again, along with other stocks that own a lot of government bonds. That means banks and insurance companies. But if governments decide to try and grow the economy by cutting taxes, deregulation, and increasing reforms, then the bond market might panic again, as it did under Liz Truss. If we're at the peak of the Laffer Curve, then neither cutting taxes nor raising them increases more tax revenue. That's the point. We're at the peak. There's no other way out. Whatever happens, we're in for a major crisis of confidence in governments. Their ability to hand out what seemed like a free lunch is coming to an end, with a massive hangover to boot. My colleague John Butler was voted #1 investment strategist by Institutional Investor magazine for his ability to navigate waters just like these during the European sovereign debt crisis. And now he's back, warning that much the same thing could happen to the UK at any moment. His presentation argues that the UK is about to run out of a shadow currency, and that risks triggering a major financial crisis. If you agree with Maxwell Marlow and me that we're at the end of our financial tether, thanks to our growing financial obligations and the inability to raise tax revenue, I think you need to see John's presentation now. You'll find a link below which reveals what the shadow currency is and what will happen if we lose it. Check it out in the comments section or the description section below. Thanks for watching.